All right. It's a long one. I'm going to try to make it quick because my wife is sleepy. And I haven't even started yet. In Israel, in Israel's history, as we're looking at the time when Israel had kings, Saul was the first king, David is the second king, and we are about to finish up, not today, but next week, the life of King David. After that, we're going to spend only 1 week on each of the kings that follow. And if you remember where we left off last week, there had been a real turning point in David's life. Everything that David had touched and attempted to do, he had succeeded. The Lord was with him because he was interested in what was important to the Lord. And then he had that little incident with Bathsheba and putting Uriah, her husband, to death, and this displeased the Lord, and this was kind of a turning point in David's kingship. And God said, you're going to have trouble in your own family. And his oldest son decides to rape his sister. And David does nothing about it. Now, folks, let me say this about disciplining your children and your grandchildren. If you're failing to discipline your children and your grandchildren because you're afraid you're going to lose them, like David's children, they may come back and try to kill you. You will lose them if you fail to discipline them, and you will be making an enemy of your own and an enemy of God's. Because the next thing we see is Absalom is mad at his daddy because his daddy, King David, failed to do anything about the rape of his sister. And so Absalom has now taken over the kingdom, and he is seeking to kill his own father. And to make matters worse, as they're on their way out of Jerusalem, the city of David comes down kind of like a V, like this. And it's because 2 brooks come down on either side of Zion, the city of David. And on the east side over here is the Kidron Brook, which flows only at certain times of the year because it's so dry. And when you cross the Kidron Valley, you go up this steep mountain that is called the Mount of Olives. And David is walking up because they are fleeing Jerusalem, he and all of his people who are loyal to him, which there are not that many. And he's crying and weeping, and all the people are crying and weeping, and David gets this tremendous news. It was told to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. In other words, one of your trusted advisors, Ahithophel, has switched sides. He has become a traitor. One of your very best friends is now on your son's side among the company of people who are trying to kill you, David. And David stops, and immediately he goes to prayer and says, "Oh Lord, I pray that you will turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Now, that doesn't mean that Ahithophel's counsel will be foolishness, but it will be perceived as foolishness in those who hear it. And then comes along another one of David's trusted advisors. His name is Hushai. And I want you to remember these 2 names, Ahithophel and Hushai. And he says to Hushai, "If you go on with me, you will be a burden to me." This is probably indicative that Hushai is an old man and he's going to slow David down because they're in a hurry to get away from Absalom. But, he says to Hushai, if you return to the city, that is Jerusalem, and you say to Absalom, my son, who has taken over my throne, "I will be your servant, O king," then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel. So, Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, when it says the men of Israel and the people, he's probably referring to all the soldiers of the whole land, came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai says to Absalom, "Long live the king," which indicates to Absalom, "Hey, I was your father's friend. Now I'm going to be one of your advisors because you're the king." So, Absalom immediately turns to Ahithophel once he gets established there in Jerusalem, and he says, "Give your counsel, Ahithophel. What do you think we ought to do?" And Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines." You remember David had left 10 of his wives, for lack of a better word, to keep the house. And all Israel will hear that you have made yourself stinky in your father's nostrils. That's what odious means. "And the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." In other words, this is a way of saying, I have ousted the king, and I'm in charge of everything, including the women and his life. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof. On the roof. And Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. That's pretty pathetic. But it's exactly what God told David 12 years earlier was going to happen. "Behold, I am going to raise up evil against you out of your own house." It means your own family. "And I'm going to take your wives before your eyes, and I'm going to give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun." Right up there on the roof. And David had no idea at the time that this person would be his own son who would do this to him. So, now you got to remember something about Ahithophel's advice. In those days, the advice which Ahithophel gave was as if someone had consulted the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and Absalom. In other words, he's saying that if Ahithophel says, "This is what we ought to do," it's just like God suddenly appeared before you and said, "This is what we ought to do." That's how good Ahithophel's advice is. Moreover, in other words, this is in addition to what Ahithophel has already advised Absalom. He said, now I want you to see how many times the first person personal pronoun, I or me, is used in his advice here, because this is going to be important. He says to Absalom, "Let me choose 12,000 men, and I will set out and pursue David tonight." Is Ahithophel a general? No, he's just part of the king's cabinet. He's an advisor, and he's probably an old man. Why does he want to lead 12,000 men against David? He says, "I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged, and throw him into a panic. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike down the king only, and I will bring back the people to you as though a bride were coming home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace." Now let's discuss Ahithophel's advice to Absalom. Because, friends, I'm going to tell you up front, this is the best possible advice that Absalom could have received. He says, 12,000 men. That's not very big compared to Israel's army. But you know what? David has a fraction of people with him compared to 12,000. He says, "And I'm going to set out and pursue David tonight." He's going to get the element of surprise. "I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged." Now, folks, this is kind of a long journey that David made in one night, possibly as much as 15 to 18 miles. He goes from Jerusalem, down in the valley, up over the mountain, and all the way down to the Jordan River on the east. And that's where he is encamped with the people. That's quite a trek. That's quite a journey. They didn't have Hondas and Toyotas. They walked. So I'll come upon him while he's weary and discouraged. Is David discouraged? We read last week that as he's trudging up the Mount of Olives, he and all the people with him are what? They're crying. They're weeping. And throw him into a panic. And it would, because they're not expecting an attack. And all the people who are with him, and it's referring to the soldiers, will run away. And I will strike down the king only, and I'll bring all the rest of the people back to you as a bride comes home to her husband. We'll all be one nation again. Only one person has to die, and we can avoid a big civil war. Okay? Ahithophel's advice is flawless, people. Flawless. And so how do they react to that? Well, before I get to that, let me tell you what David says about this betrayal. He writes about it in Psalm 41, verse 9. Even my bosom friend in whom I trusted, who ate of my bread, has lifted his heel against me. This really upset him. And as I told you before, there are parallels in David's life with Jesus' life. Now let me tell you why he says, who ate of my bread. When we sit down to eat, what do? We sit around a table, don't we? Well, they sort of did, but the table for the rich people was only about this high off the floor. The rest of the people just used a blanket. And you put the food there, and everybody lay on his elbow. You're just lying down to eat, and you raise yourself up on your elbow, and you reach in with one hand, and you feed it to yourself. And the next guy lies close to you, and his head, usually of your best friend, is right here in your bosom. And every once in a while, if you want, if he says, would you get me a piece of bread? You can take the piece of bread and you can just put it in his mouth. And that's why they're called a bosom friend. How many remember the TV show a few decades ago, Bosom Buddies? Tom Hanks, right? Well, that's where the expression is centuries old. If you had a bosom buddy, he was the one who was closest to you at the dinner table and you could feed him. Now, as I said, there are parallels in David's life with Jesus' life. David had somebody who betrayed him, who was very close to him. Jesus had somebody betray him who was very close to him, who was Judas. Judas was one who ate Jesus' bread. Do you remember at the Last Supper? Before Judas got up from the table to go out and betray Jesus, what does Jesus do? He puts a morsel of bread in Judas' mouth. Judas was that close to him at the table. He had a place of honor as one who was close to Jesus. And John quotes from this psalm in John chapter 13, verse 8, when referring to this, in order that the scripture might be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel up against me. This is God's testimony about what happened to Jesus Christ when he was betrayed. And we read from Psalm 55 this morning. This really upset David. He mentions this incident in two Psalms, Psalm 41, and he mentions it twice in Psalm 55. It's not an enemy who taunts me. It's one of my better friends. If it were an enemy, I could put up with it. But it's not an adversary who deals insolently with me, because I could just hide from him. But it is you, my equal. Wait a minute, David's the king. But David doesn't look at Ahithophel as a servant or a slave. He looks at Ahithophel as his equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to hold sweet counsel together. We would talk about important things together within God's house. We walked in fellowship. Like today we would say, hey, We went to church together. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smoother than butter, yet war was in his heart. Words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. And David had no idea that this man would betray him. Why is Ahithophel so intent on now destroying somebody that was so close to him? Well, let's back up about 12 years. It happened late one afternoon when David, who was supposed to be out with Joab and all the rest of the troops in war, got up from a nap on his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house. And he saw a very beautiful woman bathing. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and they said, well, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So Eliam is Bathsheba's father. Big deal. Well, it's about to become a big deal. Later on in 2 Samuel, we have this genealogy. Eliphalet, the son of Ahasbai of Maacah. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel. So, Ahithophel's son is Eliam. Eliam's daughter is Bathsheba. That makes Ahithophel Bathsheba's granddaddy. Now, a lot of you have met my granddaughter because we bring her to church frequently. We have two now. And I can promise you this, that if one of you did something to my granddaughter, such as David did to Bathsheba, I would be very, very upset. And Ahithophel has kept his mouth shut for 12 years. And now that Absalom has taken over the kingdom, he sees his opportunity to get back at David for what David had done to his granddaddy, or granddaughter. Sorry about that. All right, so back to the story. And the advice of Ahithophel. Remember the advice Ahithophel said, let me take 12,000 guys and we'll get him tonight. Seemed right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. You know why? Because it was good advice. And then Absalom said, let's call Hushai the Archite also, and let's hear what he has to say. Now, why would they do that? Ahithophel's advice was flawless. Why would he suddenly call somebody else? Because of the Lord. And Hushai came to Absalom. And Absalom said, this is what Ahithophel said we should do. If you don't think that's right, then you say what we should do. And Hushai said to Absalom, this time the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. And you can tell all the people in the room went, because that's never happened before. And so, Hushai says, you know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Is that true? No, they're scared and they're sorrowful. They are not angry. Besides, your father is an expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he's hidden himself in one of the pits or some other place. Is that true? No, David is down by the Jordan River with all of the people. He's not hiding. And as soon as some of your people, Absalom, fall in the first attack, whoever hears of it will say, hey, there's been a slaughter among Absalom's people. And that'll discourage everybody. None of that is true. So what do we say? But my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you. Now, this doesn't mean all the men, the women, and the children. This just means all the men of war in all 12 tribes be gathered from you from Dan to Beersheba as the sand of the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. In other words, you get all of the soldiers in the entire land, and you, Absalom, lead them into battle. This will be decisive because we have so many, and it'll also make you look good because you have led them to victory in battle. And so we shall come upon him in some place where he's to be found, and we shall light upon him as the dew falls on the ground, and of him and all the men with him, not one of them will be left. Not only are we going to destroy David, your father, because you want him dead, but anybody who was ever loyal to him, we're going to kill him too. And if David withdraws into a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city and will drag it into the valley until not even a pebble is to be found there. Folks, this is bad advice. And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. What? You guys on drugs? What are you smoking? Why did they think that his advice was better than Ahithophel's? It explains it in the next verse. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. Folks, you never know what the Lord is going to put into somebody's mind. It tells us in several places in the Old and in the New Testament that deceptive spirits will cause people to believe something is true that is not true. Or they'll think that this is good advice when it's really bad advice. This happens a lot. And this is from the Lord. And this is what he did to Absalom and all of his advisors. He manipulated their minds so that they would do what he wanted them to do. In Proverbs chapter 21, it says the heart of the king, you know, the part of a person that makes decisions. The heart of the king is like water in the Lord's hands. He turns it whichever way he wants. The Lord will make a way, not just for bad, but also for good. So be encouraged. Does it make any sense that a fella named Joseph, who gets sold into Egypt, into slavery, would find favor with the fella who has enslaved him? So much so that that fella put everything in his life in Joseph's charge. And when Joseph got sent to jail, the Lord manipulated the jailer's mind so that Joseph found favor in the jailer's heart, and he sat back and relaxed and said, Joseph, you can do my job for me. And not only that, when Joseph appears before Pharaoh, he finds Pharaoh is favorable to him too. You know why? Because of the Lord. And Pharaoh says, from now on, you're in charge of everything in the country. The Lord does that, people. I can't tell you how many times this has worked out in my favor in my life. Do you know that from the time of my last final exam in high school to the time that we graduated was more than a week? And they didn't decide until the morning of graduation that they were going to let me graduate because my grades were so bad. And I think it was because the alternative was just too unthinkable for them that I might be back the next year. And they let me graduate. And I went into the Marine Corps. I had never taken an SAT. I had never taken an ACT. I had never taken any kind of college entrance exam. And after 7 years of being in the Marine Corps, I applied to go to college. And they accepted me. It made no sense. I have gotten jobs that I shouldn't have had, promotions that I was not worthy of. Guys, don't be discouraged. If something seems impossible, God, if he wants you in that position, will fix it for you, just like he's doing for King David right now. Okay, let's continue our story. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey, and he went off home to his own city. He set his house in order, and he hanged himself. And he died, and he was buried in the tomb of his father. You remember the parallel in David's life and in Jesus' life. The parallel between David and Ahithophel prefigures or gives us a picture of what Jesus was going to go through with Judas. David was betrayed by Ahithophel. Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Ahithophel went out and hanged himself. Judas went out and hanged himself. Now, why did Ahithophel hang himself? I've heard preachers say, well, it hurt his will feelings that they didn't take his advice. Nope. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Ahithophel knows that if Absalom follows Hushai's advice, which he does, that this is going to mean defeat for Absalom. And that when David comes back to Jerusalem, he's going to have to put to death the people who betrayed him. And Ahithophel spared David the trouble. So he hanged himself. All right. So here, Absalom loses the kingship. David came over to Mahanaim. He crosses the Jordan River. Let's say that this is the Jordan River. Mahanaim is over here on the east side. And Absalom and his army, they cross the Jordan River with all the men of Israel. He's got this huge army, and David has maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people. And the king, that's David, ordered Joab, that's his general, Abishai, his brother, and Ittai. Promise me you won't name any of your children Ittai. Ittai's in charge of all of the foreigners. He says, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Absalom wants David dead. David does not want Absalom dead. And folks, try to remember that. When you have people that hate you and seek your destruction, we are Christians. We are God's people. They may want to destroy us, but it is not our attitude that we want to destroy them. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. An entire Israeli army was defeated and ran for their lives because of David's few men. Why? Because God was on David's side. Don't let the numbers bother you. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss was very great that day, 20,000 men. And the battle spread out over all the face of the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And speaking of the forest, Absalom is riding through the forest. And he's on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and the head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth. That means the sky and the land. And the mule who was under him went on. See ya. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Oh, what was he doing? Just hanging around. And Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him down there to the ground? I would have been glad to have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. What did David tell Joab? deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom? And here Joab wants him dead. And there he is, an easy target. But the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I still would not reach my hand out against the king's son, because in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I did deal treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof and said, I didn't know anything about it. And Job said, I'm not going to waste time with you like this. And folks, have you ever gotten into an argument and you are using logic and reason and good sense, and the person says, I'm not going to argue with you anymore? You know why? Because they've got nothing sensible to say. And that's what Joab has done. And he took 3 javelins in his hand, and he thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. So he kills the king's kid. So, there's a Cushite. Somebody from Cush is called a Cushite. It's not a land of cushy mattresses. It's down below Egypt, south of Egypt in Africa. It's what we now would refer to as the Sudan and Ethiopia. And Joab said to the Cushite, who is a messenger, go tell the king what you have seen. And the king said to the Cushite when he arrives, the first thing he says is it well for the young man Absalom? And the Cushite gives kind of an insensitive answer. May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. In other words, he dead. And the king was deeply moved, and he went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. Now remember, he's still over in Mahanaim, over here on the east side of the Jordan. And as the king went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, oh, that I would have died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. So, usually after a victory, when the army comes back into the city, there's a parade. Everybody's yelling and screaming and singing and dancing, and the soldiers march proudly into town. But you can't do that if your leader is crying. So, that's not how they come into town. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For all the people heard that day that the king is grieving for his son. And the people sneaked into the city. Like people sneak into a city because they're ashamed because they lost a battle. And the king covered his face. And the king was crying with a loud voice, oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. And Joab had enough of this, and he confronts the king. He says, look, these people were loyal to you. They gave their lives for you so you wouldn't be captured and killed by your own son. And you're bawling because Absalom is dead. It's like you wish that we were dead and Absalom was still alive. He says, I swear to you, David, if you don't shape up and snap out of this, all these people who were loyal to you will desert to the other side. So David snaps out of it. And now he's heading for Jerusalem. And it's a long ways from Mahanaim over here to Jerusalem on the west side of the Jordan River. And as he goes, this is how kings are brought back in to power, is that they are accompanied by all the important people that approve of them. So keep that in mind. All the people were arguing throughout all of the tribes of Israel, saying, The king delivered us from the hands of our enemies. They're reviewing all the good things that David has done. And he has saved us from the hands of the Philistines. And now he has fled out of the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, is dead in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back into Jerusalem? And so all of the tribes decide, we want David as our king again, and they start heading down to receive the king back across the Jordan River to escort him into Jerusalem with a victory parade. But King David has to send this message to Zadok and Abiathar the priests. Say to the elders of Judah, Judah is just one of the 12 tribes. Why should you, Judah, my own tribe, be the last to bring the king back to his house? I guess Judah hasn't rendered a decision yet. And that's pretty strange, because Judah was pretty much on his side, but all the other tribes were against him. And all the other tribes are saying, no, we want David back as king. David says, you're my brothers, you're my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring the king back into Jerusalem? And so he says to Amasa, Amasa was the general that fought against David and his men, are you not my bone and flesh? Because Amasa is not only from the tribe of Judah, he's actually one of David's nephews. God do so to me and more also, if you are not commander of my army now in place of Joab. And you read the story and you say, yes, it's about time he gets rid of that sinister Joab. And so Amasa swayed the heart of all of the men of Judah as one man. And so they sent word to the king, yeah, return both you and your servants. So now all the tribes are on David's side. And so the king comes back to the Jordan. Remember, he's still over here on the east side of the Jordan River. And he waits there because the protocol is a delegation will come over and they will walk across the Jordan River with you in a formal way. And Judah comes down over here to Gilgal. That's not a pretty girl. Gilgal, if you'll recall, when Joshua brought Israel across the Jordan River to attack Jericho, that's where they encamped, because it's right across the river. So the king came back to the Jordan, and Judah came over to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. Where's the rest of the tribes? Well, they haven't shown up yet. And so David and Judah, anxious to get back to Jerusalem, kind of jump the gun. And they escort him back across the river. So the king goes across over to Gilgal. And then all the men of Israel show up, all the other tribes. And they said to the king, why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household across the Jordan and all David's men with him? We are all one country. We got this tribal rivalry going on here. And all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is our close relative. He's from Judah. Why then are you angry over this matter? Shouldn't it be us? Well, the people of Israel answered this way, we have 10 shares in the king, and in David we have more people than you. Why have you despised us? Were we not the first to speak of bringing back the king, and you guys were the last? But the words of the men of Judah, were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. You know what that means? That means they were getting so upset about it that they were challenging them to a war over this. And so the men of Israel kind of backed down. And there's always ambitious people there. there happens to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjamite. He blows the trumpet and says, we have no portion in David, and we have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, Israel. And so all the men of Israel, all the other tribes, what do? They withdrew from David, and they follow Sheba, the son of Bichri. But the men of Judah follow their king steadfastly from the Jordan over here to Jerusalem. So it's only the tribe of Judah that is now loyal to David. David has now lost all the other tribes again, and they escort him into Jerusalem. And when David gets into Jerusalem, how many of you remember who Mephibosheth is? Mephibosheth is Saul's grandson. And David, instead of destroying Saul's family when he became king, has shown nothing but kindness to Saul's family. And little Mephibosheth, who is lame in his feet, gets to eat at David's table every day. And David said, all that belonged to your granddaddy Saul now belongs to you. Well, when David had to flee Jerusalem, Mephibosheth didn't show up, but Ziba, his servant, did. And he lied to David and said, Mephibosheth thinks that they're coming in to make him king today. Okay, let's see if that's true or not. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king. He had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day that the king departed until the day he came back in safety. He must have smelled real good. But guys, what are those signs of? Those are signs of depression and mourning. Mephibosheth was not happy that David had to flee Jerusalem. It doesn't match up with Ziba's lie. And when Mephibosheth came to Jerusalem to meet the king said to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And Mephibosheth answered, my lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant, that is I, Mephibosheth, said to him, I'm going to saddle a donkey for myself that I may ride on it and go with the king. Because after all, your servant is lame. It's not like I can walk with you. And what happened? He gets out there. Mephibosheth's servant Ziba had taken the donkey, gone on ahead, and given it to David. And then Mephibosheth continues, he slandered your servant. He said things about me that were not true. But my lord, the king, is like an angel of God. Do therefore whatever seems good to you. Whatever your judgment is in this matter is going to be good, because you are David and you are good. For all of my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry in complaint to the king? This is a good posture for Christians to take. Because of Adam's sin, and because we are all sinners before the Lord God, we are all people doomed to death in hell. Anything that the Lord gives us in the way of mercy that is less than hell is nothing more than his grace toward us in our lives. And why should we ever complain? We were doomed to hell because of our sin. And what did the Lord Jesus Christ do? He said, I'm standing at the door and knocking. If anybody opens the door, I'll come in to eat with him and he with me. We are welcome at the Lord's table because of his gracious mercy in our lives. He did something about our sin so that we could have a place at his table. And any time that we complain and cry out in complaint to him, it is like we're saying, that's just not enough, Lord. We want everything to be rosy. And the king says to Mephibosheth, "Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba will divide the land." And Mephibosheth said to the king, "Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come home safely." What's important to Mephibosheth? His relationship to the king. Not his possessions, not his property, but his relationship to David. Ziba lied. David eliminates the opposition. Folks, David's period of discipline from the Lord, which lasted about 12 years, is over. And David is going to start acting like a king again. The king said to Amasa, remember, Amasa replaced Joab as his general, "Call all the men of Judah together with me within 3 days, and you be here yourself." Now, he's not talking about all the males. He's talking about all the people who can serve in an army. He's sending Amasa out. "Gather an army for me from the tribe of Judah." So Amasa went out to summon Judah, but he delayed beyond the set time, the 3 days that were given to him by the king. And so David turns to Abishai. Abishai is Joab's little brother. "Now Sheba, the son of Bichri, will do us more harm than Absalom. So you take your Lord's servants, my soldiers, and pursue him, lest he get himself into fortified cities and escape from us." David jumps the gun because Amasa has not returned with an army from Judah. And he knows that this Sheba guy has to be taken care of before he gets all the rest of the tribes organized, and then they have a big civil war. And so there went after him Joab's men. So Joab goes along, and he's got some guys, and the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and I'm sure the Ittai is in charge of them, and all the mighty men. And they went out from Jerusalem to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. "Come back, little Sheba." And so, while they were at the great stone, which is at Gibeon, which is in the land of Benjamin, Amasa finally shows up to meet them. Now Joab, the former general, who has been replaced by Amasa, was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it there was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened on his thigh, and as he went forward, the sword fell out. And Joab says to Amasa, "Is it well with you, my brother?" That's a friendly greeting. And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him, but Amasa did not notice the sword that was in his left hand. And Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his intestines on the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. Hey, Amasa, you ever wonder what your intestines look like? Let me show you. He hated his guts. Then Joab and Abishai, his brother, continued to pursue Sheba, the son of Bichri. And all the men who were with Joab came and besieged him in a town called Abel of Beth Maacah, which is way up here in the north near the city of Dan. And they cast up a mound around the city and stood against the rampart, and they were battering the wall down to tear it down. And a wise woman called from over the wall, from inside the city, "Listen, listen, tell Joab to come here, because I want to talk to him." And so Joab shows up, and he says to the woman, "We are seeking a man from the hill country of Ephraim called Sheba, the son of Bichri. He has lifted his hand up against King David. Give him up alone, and I will withdraw from the city." And so the woman says to Joab, "Behold, his head shall be thrown to you over the wall." And the woman went to all the people in her wisdom, and they cut off the head of Sheba, the son of Bichri, and threw it out to Joab. "Joab, go long!" And so Joab blew the trumpet, and they dispersed from the city, every man to his home, and Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. Who was the king expecting? Amasa. And much to his dismay, who comes in leading the army? But Joab. And once again, Joab is the general under David's command. Things start to go right in David's life. He has one more sinful incident, which we'll discuss next week, and that'll be the end of our discussions about David. But try to remember this. If you are under the discipline of the Lord and things are not going entirely right in your life because of some sin, remember this. It's not going to last forever. It didn't last that way for David. David put up with it for 12 years. I'm not saying it's going to last that long for you. But as Fred mentioned in his prayer this morning, the Lord disciplines only those whom he loves. Be grateful that we do have consequences when we mess up. Don't despise it. Don't resent it. Just keep trudging on in spite of it, because it will come to an end someday, just as it has for David.